Tell Martha, going to do a live stream reading if you want to join, period. Love you.
Ready to send it? Okay, it's...
Have a good night. Oh my God. It's too funny. Okay, so I'm reading Letting Go, The Pathway of Surrender by David R. Hawkins. I can't remember who recommended this to me, but this was my choice. So someone on Twitter, I think, recommended it. As we let go of negative feelings, there is a progressive movement up to the scale to courage and then beyond, with increasing effectiveness, success, and more effortless abundance. We tend to seek out such people. So there's people that have like positive emotions, like courage, or positive energy, he calls it, like courage, joy, love. He kind of ranks them. And then down below, it's like apathy, shame, guilt. We tend to seek out such people. We say they are high. They give off life energy to all living things around them. Animals are attracted to them. They have a green thumb and positively influence the lives of all with whom they come in contact. At the level of courage, the negative feelings have not all disappeared, but now we have sufficient energy to handle them because we re-owned our power and self-adequacy. The fastest way to move from the bottom to the top is by telling the truth to ourselves and to others. The energy levels are also traditionally associated with the body energy centers that are sometimes referred to as chakras. The chakras are energy through which Kundalini energy is said to flow. Once it is awakened at the level of courage 200, the energy centers, chakras, can be measured by a variety of clinical techniques and sensitive electronic instruments. On the map of consciousness, the chakras calibrate as follows: crown 600, third eye 525, throat 350, heart 505, solar plexus 275, sacral or spleen 275, base or root chakra 200. When we relinquish negative energy, when we relinquish negative feelings, the energy in our higher chakras increases. For instance, instead of habitually venting our spleen, second chakra, we are now described as all heart, fifth chakra. This energy system has a direct impact on the physical body. The energy in each chakra flows out through tunnels or through channels called meridians to the whole energy body, which is like a blueprint to the physical body. It's interesting. I was just talking to someone about this. I don't know anything about this. Each meridian is associated with a particular organ, and each organ is associated with a particular emotion. A negative emotion throws off the energy balance of its associated acupuncture meridian and related organ. For instance, depression, despair, and melancholy are associated with the liver meridian, so these emotions tend to interfere with liver function. Every negative feeling impairs a body organ, and as the years go by, that organ becomes diseased and eventually fails to function. The lower our emotional state, the more negatively we influence not only our own lives, but the lives of those around us. The higher the emotional level of evolution, the more positive our life becomes on all levels, and we support all life around us. As negative emotions are acknowledged and surrendered, we get freer and move up the scale, eventually experiencing predominantly positive feelings. Sounds good. All lower emotions are limitations and blind us to the reality of our true self. As we surrender our way up the scale and near the top, a new type of experience begins to happen. At the very top of the scale, there occurs the realization of one's true self and the varying levels of illumination. The main importance of this is to note that as we get higher and freer, what the world calls spiritual awareness, intuition, and growth of consciousness occur. This is the common experience of all who surrender their negative feelings. They become more and more conscious. That which is impossible to experience at lower levels of consciousness becomes self-evident and stunningly obvious at higher levels. Understanding emotions. According to scientific findings, all thoughts are filed in the mind's memory bank under a filing system based upon the associated feeling and its finer gradations. They are filed according to feeling tone, not fact. Consequently, there is a scientific basis for the observation that self-awareness is increased much more rapidly by observing feelings rather than thoughts. The thoughts associated with even one feeling may literally run into the thousands. The understanding of the underlying emotion and its correct handling is therefore more rewarding and less time-consuming than dealing with one's thoughts. In the beginning, if one is unfamiliar with the whole subject of feelings, it is often advisable to begin merely by observing them without any intention of doing anything about them. In this way, some clarification will occur about the relationship between feelings and thoughts. After there is more familiarity, some experimentation can then occur. For instance, certain areas of thoughts that tend to reoccur can be set aside and the feeling associated with them identified. The feeling can then be worked with by first accepting that it is there without resisting it or condemning it. And then one begins to empty out the energy of the feeling directly by letting it be what it is until it runs out. Right? Because the whole thing is like as opposed to repressing or suppressing or avoiding, like actually feeling the feeling. Interesting. Somewhat later, the former thoughts can now be looked at and their character will be observed to have changed. If the feeling has been totally surrendered and let go, usually all thoughts associated with it will have disappeared entirely and been replaced by a concluding thought which handles the matter quickly. For example, there was the case of a man who misplaced his passport shortly before going to a foreign country. As the scheduled date of departure grew closer and closer, his inner panic mounted. His mind raced wildly, trying to think where the passport could have been misplaced. He searched high and low. He tried various mental tricks to no avail. He berated himself. How could I have been so stupid as to lose a passport? Now there isn't time to get another one. As the fateful day approached, he faced a real dilemma. No passport, no trip. Missing the trip had a lot of negative consequences because it was both business and pleasure, and it would have created a difficult situation. Finally, he remembered to do the letting go technique. He sat down and asked himself, what is the basic feeling that I've been ignoring? To his surprise, the basic feeling that came up was grief. The grief was associated with not wanting to be separated from someone he dearly loved. There was also an associated fear of loss of the relationship, or at least the weakening of it due to his absence. As he let go of the grief and the associated fear, he suddenly felt at peace about the matter. He also concluded that if the relationship couldn't handle a 2-week absence, it wasn't worth all that much anyway. So there was really nothing at risk. As soon as he felt at peace, he instantly remembered where the passport was. In fact, it was in a place so obvious and simple that only unconscious blocking could explain why he had not remembered it. Needless to say, all of the thousands of thoughts about the missing passport, the failed trip, and the potential consequences instantly disappeared. His emotional state became one of gratitude and happiness instead of frustration. Oh, wait, turns out my wife's awake. So I am going to send her the link. Oh, there she is. Hi. You found my stream. Okay, I'm going to go back to the story because the story is really good. So he's talking about like once you surrender a feeling, like you can have tons of thoughts associated to a certain feeling, but once you surrender the feeling, then all the thoughts just disappear and you're left with one kind of conclusion. Okay, so there's an example of a man who misplaced his passport shortly before going to a foreign country. As the scheduled date of departure grew closer and closer, his inner panic mounted. His mind raced wildly, trying to think where the passport could have been misplaced. He searched high and low. He tried various mental tricks to no avail. He berated himself. How could I have been so stupid as to lose a passport? Now there isn't time to get another one. As the fateful day approached, he faced a real dilemma. No passport, no trip. Missing the trip had a lot of negative consequences because it was both business and pleasure, and it would have created a difficult situation. Finally, he remembered to do the letting go technique. He sat down and asked himself, what is the basic feeling that I've been ignoring? To his surprise, the basic feeling that came up was grief. The grief was associated with not wanting to be separated from someone he dearly loved. There was also an associated fear of loss of the relationship, or at least the weakening of it due to his absence. As he let go of the grief and the associated fear, he suddenly felt at peace about the matter. He also concluded that if the relationship couldn't handle a 2-week absence, it wasn't worth all that much anyway. So there was really nothing at risk. As soon as he felt at peace, he instantly remembered where the passport was. In fact, it was in a place so simple and obvious that only unconscious blocking could explain why he had not remembered it. Needless to say, all of the thousands of thoughts about the missing passport, the failed trip, and the potential consequences instantly disappeared. His emotional state became one of gratitude and happiness instead of frustration. Letting go can be very useful in everyday situations. I wonder what are you doing? I guess it doesn't matter. Letting go can be very useful in everyday life situations, but its use in life crises can be crucial in preventing and alleviating large amounts of suffering. In a life crisis, there is usually an overwhelm of emotion. The crisis has tapped into one of our major areas of suppressed or repressed feelings. In this situation, the problem is not one of identifying the emotion, but how to handle the overwhelm. Handling emotional crises. Because this is a very difficult problem for most people, some details are needed. There are several techniques to help move through emotional disaster much more quickly and with a better end result than allowing it to run out on its own. Recall the usual mechanisms that the mind unconsciously uses to handle emotions, which are suppression or repression, expression, and escape. These are deleterious only when they are used without conscious intent. In an overwhelm, it is often advisable to utilize them, but doing so consciously. The purpose of this maneuver is to reduce the sheer overwhelming quantity of the emotion itself so that it can be disassembled and let go of in bits and pieces. This process is described below. Thus, in this case, it is all right consciously to push away as much of the emotion as we are capable of at the moment. The emotion can be reduced in intensity by sharing the feeling with close friends or mentors. By merely expressing the feeling, some of the energy behind it is reduced. It is also all right in this circumstance consciously to utilize escape mechanisms, such as going out in a social situation to get some distance from the upset, playing with a dog, watching television, going to the movies, playing music, making love, or whatever one's habit is under the circumstances. When the feeling has been reduced in its sheer quantity and intensity, it is best to start letting go of small aspects of the situation rather than the overall situation and the accompanying emotion itself. To illustrate this point, let's take the example of a man who loses his job after many years with a company and is now in an overwhelm of despair. By utilizing the three mechanisms already described, some of the emotion can be reduced. What he can look at then are some of the small trivia about the job. For instance, he could let go of wanting to have lunch where he always had lunch with his. Oh, for instance, could he let go of wanting to have lunch where he always had lunch with his business colleagues? Could he let go of wanting to park his car in the parking space he always had in the past? Could he let go of wanting to ride up in the same elevator? Could he let go of the attachment of the desk? Could he let go of the attachment to the secretary and her friendliness toward him? Could he let go of the attachment to his computer? Could he let go of seeing the same boss every day? Could he let go of his feeling of familiarity with the background noises in the office? Yeah, that's so interesting. Like you so rarely, I mean, just dividing it up like that, like all those things you don't even aren't even aware of that you even enjoy or will miss. The purpose of surrendering these smaller aspects of losing a job, which may seem trivial, is that it gets the mind into the letting go mode. The letting go mode takes us up to the level of courage. The negative feelings have been acknowledged and worked through. Consequently, they've lost their charge. Suddenly, there is the awareness that we have the courage to face the situation, recognize our feelings, and do something about them. As the trivia are surrendered, curiously, the main event becomes less and less oppressive. The reason for the phenomenon is that when we use the mechanism of surrender on one emotion, we are surrendering on all emotions at the same time. It is as though all emotions have the same underlying energy, so that to surrender in one direction surrenders feelings which appear on the surface to be in an opposite direction. This is a matter of clinical experience. It must be tried personally in order to believe it. After utilizing the above four methods, suppression, expression, escape, surrender of smaller aspects, a fifth now becomes apparent. Every strong emotion is really a composite of a number of subsidiary emotions, and the total emotional complex can be disassembled. Thus, for instance, the man who lost his job initially has an overwhelming feeling of despair. But as he begins to surrender around the periphery, and as he diminishes his overwhelm through consciously utilizing escape, suppression, and expression, he now realizes that there is also anger. He sees that the anger is associated with pride. There is a lot of anger in the form of resentment. There is self-invalidation, which is a form of anger expressed against himself. There is also considerable fear. Thus, these associated emotions can now be addressed directly. For instance, he can start letting go of the fear that he won't find another job. When that fear is acknowledged and let go, all the alternate possibilities that exist will become suddenly apparent to him. And as he surrenders pride, he will quickly see that he is not faced with economic disaster as he had thought. Thus, as the disassembled emotional complex is taken apart into its component parts. Each component part now has less energy and can be surrendered individually. As we come out of the overwhelm, it will be remembered that a certain portion of the emotion was purposely suppressed or escaped. It can now be re-examined so that it no longer does residual harm, such as ending up in bitterness, unconscious guilt, or lower self-esteem. Fragments of the emotional complex may recur for a period of time, even years. However, they are now small fragments. Each can be handled as it arises. At least the crisis situation will have passed through safely and consciously. Handling a crisis from the emotional rather than the intellectual level will shorten its duration dramatically. In the case of someone who loses a job, handling it from the intellectual level will produce thousands of thoughts and hypothetical scenarios. The person suffers through many sleepless nights due to the racing thoughts about the situation, as the mind reviews it over and over again. All of this is fruitless. Until the underlying emotion is surrendered, the thoughts will be engendered endlessly. We all know of people who have had an emotional crisis many years ago and to this day have not recovered. It has totally colored their life, and they have paid a big price for their lack of know-how in handling the underlying emotions. There are numerous benefits to handling a life crisis successfully. For one thing, the amount of suppressed or repressed emotion is now much less. The crisis has forced it up to be relinquished, and therefore the amount that is left in the reservoir is much less. There is a greater feeling of self-esteem and confidence because there is the awareness that one can survive and handle whatever life will bring. There is an overall reduction of the fear of life, a greater feeling of mastery, greater compassion for the suffering of others, and an increased ability to help them through similar circumstances. Paradoxically, after a life crisis, there often is a period of variable duration of peace and calmness, sometimes approaching the level of mystical experience. The dark night of the soul frequently precedes states of heightened awareness. I'm going to read that again. There is an overall reduction of the fear of life, a greater feeling of mastery, greater compassion for the suffering of others, and an increased ability to help them through similar circumstances. Paradoxically, after a life crisis, there often is a period of variable duration of peace and calmness, sometimes approaching the level of mystical experience. One of the best known examples of this paradox is illustrated by persons who have had near-death experiences. There are now many books on the subject that reveal a certain commonality. Once the worst of all possible fears, the dread and shock of death, has been faced. It is superseded by a profound sense of serenity, peace, oneness, and immunity from fear. Many such persons develop extraordinary abilities, become healers, develop psychic awareness, an advanced state of spiritual illumination. They experience major leaps in growth and the sudden appearance of new talents and capacities. Thus, every life crisis carries within it the kernels of a reversal, a renewal, an expansion, a leap in consciousness, and a letting go of the old and a birth of the new. I feel like I'm close to that. Healing the past. When we look at our lives, we will see the residual of past life crises which are still unresolved. Thoughts and feelings about the events tend to occur and color our perception, and we will note that they have disabled us in certain areas of life. At that point, it is wise to ask ourselves if it is worth paying the continuing cost. Now that we have some mechanisms by which to handle these residuals, they can be uncovered. The residual feelings can be investigated and let go of so that a healing can take place. This brings us to another emotional healing technique that becomes powerful once the major event has passed. That is to place the event in a different context, to see it from a different perspective, and to hold it in a different paradigm with a different significance and meaning. Yeah, that's so fascinating. Talking about like thoughts, or like how like the thing with like the passport, like once the emotion changed, the thoughts like disappeared, but they can also like change, or because they're being colored by the emotions. Even if they stay the same, they're going to be different. It is said that most people spend their lives regretting the past and fearing the future. Therefore, they are unable to experience joy in the present. Many of us have assumed that this is our human fate, our lot, and the best we can do is grin and bear it. Philosophers have sometimes made hay out of this negativistic, pessimistic approach and developed whole systems of nihilism. These philosophers, some of whom have become celebrated over the years, are obviously mere victims of painful emotions that they did not handle, and which triggered endless intellectualization and elaboration. Some spent their entire lifetime constructing sophisticated intellectual systems to justify what is glaringly obvious as a simple suppressed emotion. That'd be embarrassing to admit. One of the most effective tools for handling the past is the creation of a different context. What this means is that we give it a different meaning. We take on a different attitude about the past difficulty or trauma, and we acknowledge the hidden gift in it. The value of this technique was first recognized in psychiatry by Viktor Frankl. He explained the approach, which he called logotherapy, in his famous book, Man's Search for Meaning. His clinical and personal experience demonstrated that emotional events and traumatic occurrences will change considerably and be healed if a new meaning is placed around them. Frankl told of his own experience of the Nazi concentration camps, wherein he came to see his physical and psychic suffering as an opportunity to achieve inner triumph. Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. And that's quoting Frankl. Frankl recontextualized the horrific circumstances to hold profound meaning for the human spirit. Every life experience, no matter how tragic, contains a hidden lesson. When we discover and acknowledge the hidden gift that is there, a healing takes place. In the example of the man who lost his job, after some time had passed, he looked back and saw that his former job was stunting, that he had been in a rut. Frankly, the job had given him an ulcer. Prior to losing the job, he had seen only the pleasures from it. Once outside of the situation, he began to see the costs that he had been paying, physically, mentally, and emotionally. After losing the job, he was open to discovering new abilities and new talents. In fact, he began a new, more promising career. So, life events are opportunities to grow, expand, experience, and develop. In some cases, it seems in retrospect that there was actually this unconscious purpose behind the event, as though our unconscious knew that something important had to be learned, and painful as it was the only way it could be brought into experience. This is part of the psychology of the psychoanalyst Carl Jung, who concluded after a lifetime of study that there is an inborn drive in the unconscious towards wholeness, completeness, and realization of the self, and that the unconscious will devise the ways and means of bringing this about, even if they are traumatic to the conscious mind. Jung also said that in the unconscious, there was an aspect of ourselves called the shadow. The shadow is all the repressed thoughts, feelings, and concepts about ourselves that we do not want to face. One benefit of a crisis is that it often brings us into familiarity with our shadow. It makes us more human and more whole to realize what we share with all of humanity. All the stuff that we thought they were guilty of is equally in ourselves. Thus, when it is brought up to conscious awareness, acknowledged, and surrendered, it no longer unconsciously runs us. Once the shadow has been acknowledged, it loses its power. All that is necessary is merely to recognize that we have certain forbidden impulses, thoughts, and feelings. Now they can be handled with a so what. Passing through a life crisis makes us more human, more compassionate, more accepting, and understanding of ourselves and others. We no longer have to indulge in making others wrong or making ourselves wrong. Handling an emotional crisis leads to greater wisdom and results in lifetime benefits. Fear of life is really the fear of emotions. It is not the facts that we fear, but our feelings about them. Amen. Once we have mastery over our feelings, our fear of life diminishes. We feel a greater self-confidence, and we are willing to take greater chances because we now feel that we can handle the emotional consequences, whatever they might be. Because fear is the basis of all inhibitions, mastery over fear means the unblocking of whole avenues of life experience that previously had been avoided. Thus, the man who successfully handles the crisis of losing a job will never again experience that same fear. He will therefore be more creative on the next job, willing to take the necessary risks to make it a success. He begins to see how that haunting fear of job loss had severely limited his performance in the past, made him fearful and cautious, and cost him self-esteem due to his kowtowing and compliance with his superiors. One benefit of a life crisis is greater self-awareness. The situation is overwhelming, and we are forced to stop all our diversionary games, take a good look at our life situation, and reevaluate our beliefs, goals, values, and life direction. It is an opportunity to reevaluate and let go of guilt. It is also an opportunity for a total shift in attitude. Life crises, as we pass through them, confront us with polar opposites. Shall we hate or forgive that person? Shall we learn from this experience and grow, or resent it and become bitter? Do we choose to overlook the other person's shortcomings and our own, or instead do we resent and mentally attack them? Shall we withdraw from a similar situation in the future with greater fear, or shall we transcend this crisis and master it once and for all? Do we choose hope or discouragement? Can we use the experience as an opportunity to learn how to share, or shall we withdraw into a shell of fear and bitterness? Every emotional experience is an opportunity to go up or down. Which do we choose? That is the confrontation. We have the opportunity to choose whether we want to hang on or let go of emotional upsets. We can look at the cost of hanging on to them. Do we want to pay that price? Are we willing to accept the feelings? We can look at the benefits of letting go of them. The choice we make will determine our future. What kind of future do we want? Will we choose to be healed, or will we become one of the walking wounded? In making this choice, it is well to look at the payoff we get from hanging on to the residuals of a painful experience. Right, we wouldn't do it if we didn't like it. What are the satisfactions we are getting? How little are we willing to settle for? Anger, hatred, self-pity, resentments. They all have their cheap little payoff, that little inner satisfaction. Let's not pretend that it's not there. There is a weird, quirky pleasure when we hang on to pain. It certainly satisfies our unconscious need for the alleviation of guilt through punishment. We get to feel miserable and rotten. The question then arises, but for how long? Take, for example, a man who had not spoken to his brother for 23 years. Neither of them could remember what the incident was about. It had been long forgotten. But they were in the habit of not speaking, and so for 23 years they paid the price of missing each other's company, affection, togetherness in family matters, and all the shared experiences and love they could have had. When the man learned about the mechanism of surrender, he began to let go of his feelings about his brother. Suddenly, he broke out in tears of grief, realizing all that had been lost over the years. By forgiving his brother, he triggered a similar response in the brother, and the two were united. Then one of the brothers flashed back on the incident. It had been an argument over a pair of tennis shoes. Over one pair of tennis shoes, they had paid a price extending over 23 years. Had the man not learned the technique of letting go, he might well have gone to his grave with the same resentment. So the question is, how long do we want to go on suffering? When are we willing to give it up? When is enough enough? The part of us that wants to cling to negative emotions is our smallness. It is the part of us that is mean, petty, selfish, competitive, cheap, conniving, mistrusting, vindictive, judgmental, diminished, weak, guilty, ashamed, and vain. It has little energy. It is depleting, demanding, demeaning, and leads to the lowering of self-respect. It is the small part of us that accounts for our own self-hatred, unending guilt, and seeking for punishment, sickness, and disease. Is that the part with which we want to identify? Is that the part we want to energize? Is that the way we want to see ourselves? Because if that's the way we see ourselves, that's the way others will see us. The world can only see us as we see ourselves. Are we willing to pay those consequences? If we see ourselves cheap and petty, it's unlikely that we'll be at the top of the company list for a raise. The price of holding on to smallness can be demonstrated with muscle testing. The procedure is fairly simple. Hold in mind a mean, petty thought and have someone press down on your arm while you resist. Notice the effect. Now choose the exact opposite view. Picture yourself as being generous, forgiving, loving, and experiencing your inner greatness. Instantly, there will be an enormous increase in muscle strength, indicating a surge of positive bioenergy. Smallness brings weakness, sickness, disease, death. Do you really want that? Letting go of negative feelings can be accompanied by another very healthy maneuver, which will greatly assist your inner transformation, and that is to stop resisting the positive emotions. All right, that's it for now. That was just what I needed to hear tonight. So hopefully you liked it too.